In the meantime, he had found nothing of any value but the silver and the trinkets, and neither of these were in our way. Underneath there was an old boat clock, whitened with the sea salt on many a harbor noir. My mother pulled it up with impatience, and there lay before us the last things in the chest. A bundle tied up in an oilcloth and looking like papers, and the canvas bag that gave forth at a touch the jingle of gold. I'll show these rogues that I'm an honest woman, said my mother. I'll have my dues and not the farthing over. Hold Mrs. Closey's bag. And she began to count over the amount of the captain's score from the sailor's bag into the one that I was holding. It was a long, difficult business, for the coins were of all countries and sizes, doubloons and louis d'ors and guineas and pieces of eight, and I know not what besides, all shaken together at random. The guineas, too, were about the scarcest, and it was with these only that my mother knew how to make her count. When we were about halfway through, I suddenly put my hand upon her arm, for I had heard, in the silent frosty air, a sound that brought my heart into my mouth. The tap-tapping of the blind man's stick upon the frozen road. I drew nearer and nearer, while we sat holding our breath. Then it struck sharp on the indoor, and we could hear the handle being turned, and the bolt rattling as the wretch being tried to enter. And then there was a long time of silence both within and without. At last the tapping recommenced, and to our indescribable joy and gratitude, died slowly away again until it ceased to be heard. Mother, said I, take the whole and let's be going, for I was sure the bolted door must have seemed suspicious, and would bring the whole hornet nest about our ears, though how thankful I was that I had bolted it, none could tell, who had never met the terrible blind man. But my mother, frightened as she was, could not consent to take a fraction more than it was due to her, and was obstinately unwilling to be content with less. It was not yet 7, she said. By a long way she knew her rights, and she would have them. And she was still arguing with me when a little low whistle sounded a good way off upon the hill. That was enough, and more than enough for both of us. I'll take what I have, she said, jumping to her feet, and I'll take this to square the count, I said, picking up the oilskin packet. The next moment we were both groping downstairs, leaving the candle by the empty chest, and next we had opened the door and we were in the full retreat. We had not started a moment too soon. The fog was rapidly dispersing. Already the moon shone quite clear on the high ground on either side, and it was only at the exact bottom of the dell and around the tavern door that a thin veil still hung unbroken to conceal the first steps of our escape, far less than halfway to the hamlet, very little beyond to the bottom of the hill. We must come forth into the moonlight. Nor was this all, for the sound of several footsteps running came already to our ears as we looked back in their direction. A light tossing to and fro, and still rapidly advancing, showed that one of the newcomers carried a lantern. My dear, said my mother suddenly, take the money and run on. I'm going to faint. It was certainly the end for both of us, I thought. How I cursed the cowardice of the neighbors, how I blamed my poor mother for her honesty and her greed, for her past foolhardiness and the present weakness. We were just at the little bridge, by good fortune, and I helped her, tottering as she was, to the edge of the bank, where sure enough she gave a sigh and fell to my shoulder. I do not know how I found the strength to do it all, at all, and I'm still afraid it was roughly done, but I managed to drag her down the bank and a little way under the arch. Farther, I could not move her, for the bridge was too low to let me do more than crawl below it. So there we had to stay, my mother most entirely exposed, and both of us within the earshot of the inn. The Last of the Blind Man, Chapter 5. My curiosity, in a sense, was stronger than my fear, for I could not remain where I was, but kept back to the bank again, whence, sheltering my head behind a bush of broom, I might command the road before my door. I was scarcely in the position ere my enemies began to arrive, 7 or 8 of them, running hard, their feet beating out of time along the road, and the men with the lanterns some paces in front. 3 men ran together, hand in hand, and I made out, even through the mist, that the middle man of the trio was the blind beggar. The next moment, his voice showed me that I was right. "Down with the door," he cried. "Aye, sir," answered the 2 or 3, and a rush was made upon the Admiral Benbow, the lantern bearer following, and then I could see them pause, and hear the speeches passed into lower key, as they were surprised to find the door open. But the pause was brief, for the blind man again issued his commands. His voice sounded louder and higher, as he were afire with eagerness and rage. In, he shouted, and cursed them for their delay. 4 or 5 of them obeyed at once, 2 remaining on the road with the formidable beggar. There was a pause, then a cry of surprise, and then a voice shouting from the house, "Bill's dead!" But the blind man swore at them again for their delay. "Search him, some of you shirking lubbers, and the rest of you loft and get the chest," he cried. I could hear their feet rattling up our hall stairs, so that the house must have shook with it. Promptly afterwards, fresh sounds of astonishment arose. The window of the captain's room was thrown open with a slam and a jingle of broken glass, and a man leaned out the moonlight, head and shoulders, and addressed the blind beggar on the road below. "Phew," he cried, "they've been before us. Someone turned the chest out alow and aloft. Is it there?" roared Pew. "The money's there." The blind man cursed the money. "Flint's fist, he cried. We don't see it here." "No, how?" returned the man. "Here, you below there. Is it on Bill?" cried the blind man again. At that another fellow, probably him who had remained below to search the captain's body, came to the door of the inn. "Bill's been overhauled already," he said. "Nothing left." "It's these people of the inn. It's that boy. I wish I put his eyes out," cried the blind man, Pew. "There were no time ago. They had the door bolted when I tried it. Scatter, lads, and find them." "Sure enough, they left their glim here," said the fellow from the window. "Scatter and find them. Rout the house out," reiterated Pew, striking with his stick upon the road. When there followed a great to-do through all our old inn, heavy feet pounding to and fro, furniture thrown over, door kicks in, until the very rocks re-echoed, and the men came out again, one after another, on the road, and declared that they were nowhere to be found. We were nowhere to be found, and just the same whistle that had alarmed my mother and myself over the dead captain's money was once more clearly audible through the night, but this time twice repeated. I had thought it to be the blind man's trumpet, so to speak, summoning his crew to the assault. But I've now found that it was a signal from the hillside toward the hamlet, and from its effect from the buccaneers, a signal to warn them of approaching danger. "There's Dirk again," said one. "Twice. We'll have to budge, mates." "Budge, you skulk," cried Pew. "Dirk was a fool and a coward from the first. You wouldn't mind him. They must be close by. They can't be far. You have your hands on it. Scatter and look for them, dogs." "Oh, shiver my soul," he cried, "if I had eyes." This appeal seemed to produce some effect, for 2 of the fellows began to look here and there among the lumber, but half-heartedly, I thought, and with half an eye to eye to their own danger all the time, while the rest stood irresolute on the road. You have your hands on thousands, you fools, and you hang a leg. You'd be rich as kings if you could find it, and you know it's here, and you stand here skulking. There wasn't one of you there faced Bill, and I did it, a blind man, and I'm to lose my chance for you. I'm to be a poor crawling beggar, sponging for rum, when I might be rolling on a couch. If you had the pluck of the weevil on a biscuit, you wouldn't catch them still. Hang it, Pew. Got the doublons, grumbled one. They might have hit the blessed thing, said another. Take the Georges, Pew, and don't stand here squalling. Squalling was the word for it. Pew's anger rose so high that these objections, till at last, his passion completely taking the upper hand, he struck at them right and left in his blindness, and his stick sounded heavily on more than one. These, in turn, cursed back at the blind miscreant, threatened him on horrid terms, and tried in vain to catch the stick, and the rest it from his grasp. The squirrel was the saving of us, for while it was still raging, another sound came from the top of the hill on the side of the hamlet, the tramp of horses galloping. Almost at the same time, a pistol shot, flash and report, came from the hedge side, and there was plainly the last signal of danger, for the buccaneers turned at once and ran, separating in every direction, one seaward along the cove, one slant across the hill, and so on, and in that half a minute not a sign of them remained but Pew. Him they had deserted, whether in sheer panic or out of revenge for his ill words and blows, I know not. But there he remained behind, tapping up and down the road in a frenzy, and groping and calling for his comrades. Finally, he took a wrong turn and ran a few steps past me, toward the hamlet, crying, "Johnny Black Dog Dirk," and other names. "You won't leave old Pew, mates, not old Pew." Just then the noise of horses stopped to the rise, and 4 or 5 riders came in sight in the moonlight and swept at a full gallop down the slope. At this Pew saw his error, turned with a scream, and ran straight for the ditch, into which he rolled. But he wasn't on his feet again in a second, and made another dash, now utterly bewildered, right under the nearest of the coming horses. The rider tried to save him, but in vain. Down went Pew with a cry that rang high into the night, and the 4 hoofs trampled and spurned him as passed by. He fell on his side, then gently collapsed upon his face, and moved no more. I leaped to my feet and hailed the riders. They were pulling up, at any rate, horrified at the accident, and I soon saw what they were. One tailing out behind the rest was a lad that had gone from the hamlet of Dr. Livesey. The rest were revenue officers, whom he had met by the way, and with whom he had the intelligence to return at once. Some news of the lugger in the Kit's Hole had found his way to the supervisor's dens, and set him forth at night in our direction, and to that circumstance my mother and I owed our preservation from death. Pew was dead stone. As for my mother, when we carried her up to the hamlet, a little cold water and salt, and that soon brought her back again, and she was none of the worse for her terror, though she still continued to deplore the balance of money. In the meantime, the supervisor rode on, as fast as he could, to the Kit's Hole, but his men had to dismount and grope down the dingle, leading and sometimes supporting their horses, in a continual fear of the ambushes. So it was no great matter for surprise that when they got down to the hole, the lugger was already under way. Still closer, he hailed her. A voice replied, telling him to keep out of the moonlight, or he would get some lead in him. And at the same time a bullet whistled close by his arm. Soon after, the lugger doubled the point and disappeared. Mr. Dance stood there, as he said, like a fish out of the water. And all he could do was to dispatch a man to warn the cutter. And that, said he, it's just about as good as nothing. They've got off clean, and there's an end. Only, he added, I'm glad to trod on Master Spew's corn, for this time he heard my story. I went back with him to the Admiral Benbow, and you cannot imagine a house in such a state of smash. The very clock had been thrown down by these fellows in their furious hunt after my mother and myself, and though nothing had actually been taken away except the captain's money bag and a little silver from the till, I could see at once that we were ruined. Mr. Dance could make nothing of the scene. They got the money, do you say? Well then, Hawkins, what in the fortune were they after? More money, I suppose. No, sir, not money, I think, I replied. In fact, sir, I believe I have the thing in my breast pocket. And to tell you the truth, I should like to get it put in safety. To be sure, boy, quite right, said he. I'll take it, if you like. Perhaps, Mr. Lively, I began. Perfectly right, he interrupted very cheerily. Perfectly right, a gentleman and a magistrate. And now I come to think of it, I might as well ride around there myself and report to him or Squire. Master Pew's dead when all's done, not that I regret it, but he's dead, you see, and people will make it out against an officer of His Majesty's revenue, if make it out they can. Now, I tell you, Hawkins, if you like, I'll take you along. I thanked him heartily for the offer, and we walked back to the hamlet where the horses were. By the time I had told my mother of my purpose, they were all in the saddle. Dogger, said Mr. Dance, if you have a good horse, take up with this lad behind you. As soon as I was mounted, holding on to the dogger's belt, the supervisor gave the word, and the party struck out at a bouncing trot on the road to Dr. Lively's house. The captain's papers. We rode hard all the way till we drew up before Dr. Lively's door. The house was all dark to the front. Mr. Dance told me to jump down and knock, and Dogger gave me a stirrup to descend by. The door was opened almost at once by the maid. Is Dr. Livesey in? I asked. No, she said. He had come home in the afternoon, but had gone up to the hall to dine and pass the evening with the squire. So there we go, boys, said Dr. Dance. This time, as the distance was short, I did not mount, but ran with Dodger's stirrup leather to the lodge gates and up the long, leafless, moonlit avenue to where the white line of the whole building sloped, on either hand of the great old gardens. Here Mr. Dance dismounted, and taking me along with him, was admitted at a word into the house. The servant led us down to a mated passage, and showed us at the end to a great library, all lined with bookcases and busts upon the top of them, where the squire and Mr. Livesey sat, pipe in hand, on either side of a bright fire. I had never seen the squire so near at hand. He was a tall man, over 6 feet high, and broad in proportion, and had a bluff, rough and ready face, all roughened and reddened and lined in his long travels. His eyebrows were very black, and moved readily, and gave him a look of some temper, not bad, you would say, but quick and high. Come in, Mr. Dance, said he, very stately and condescending. Good evening, Dance, says the doctor, with a nod, and good evening to you, friend Jim. What good wind brings you here? The supervisor stood up straight and stiff and told his story like a lesson, and you should have seen how the two gentlemen leaned forward and looked at each other and forgot to smoke in their surprise and interest when they heard how my mother went back to the inn Dr. Livesey fairly slapped his thigh, and the squire cried bravo, and broke his long pipe against the grate. Long before it was done, Mr. Trelawney, that you will remember was the squire's name, had got up from his seat and was striding about the room, and the doctor, as if to hear the better, had taken off his powdered wig, and sat there looking very strange indeed with his own close-cropped black poll. At last, Mr. Downes finished the story. "Mr. Downes," said the squire, "you are a very noble fellow. As for the writing down that black, atrocious miscreant, I regret it as an act of virtue, sir, like a stamping on a cockroach. This lad, Hawkins, is a trump, I perceive. Hawkins, will you ring the bell? Mr. Downes must have some ale." "And so, Jim," said the doctor, "you have the thing that they were after, have you?" "Here it is, sir," said I, and gave him the oilskin packet. The doctor looked it all over, as if his fingers were itching to open it, but instead of doing that, he put it in quietly in the pocket of his coat. "Squire," said he, "when Downes has had his ale, he must of course be off on his Majesty's service, but I mean to keep Jim Hawkins here to sleep at my house, with your permission. I propose that we should have the cold pie and let him sup." "As you will, Livesey," said the squire. Hawkins had earned better than cold pie, so a big pigeon pie was brought in and put on the side table, and I made a hearty supper, for I was as hungry as a hawk, while Mr. Downes was further complimented and at last dismissed. "And now, squire," said the doctor, "and now, Dr. Livesey," said the squire in the same breath. At a time, laughed Dr. Livesey. "Have you heard of this Flint, I suppose?" "Heard of him?" cried the squire. "Heard of him, you say? He was the bloodthirstiest buccaneer that sailed. Blackbird was a child to Flint. The Spaniards were so prodigiously afraid of him that I tell you, sir, I was sometimes proud he was an Englishman. I've seen his topsails with these eyes off Trinidad, and the cowardly son of the rum puncheon that I sailed with you put back, sir, into the port of Spain." "Well, I've heard of him myself in England," said the doctor, "but the point is, had he money?" "Money?" cried the squire. "Have you heard the story? What were these villains after but the money? What do they care but for the money? For what would they risk their rascal carcasses but money? That shall we know soon," replied the doctor. "But you are so confoundedly hot-headed and exclamatory that I cannot get a word in. What I want to know is this. Supposing that I have here in my pocket some clue where Flint buried his treasure, will the treasure amount to much?" "Amount, sir?" cried the squire. "It will amount to this. If we have the clue you talk about, I fit out a ship in Bristol dock, and take you and Hawkins here along, and I'll have the treasure if I search a year." "Very well," said the doctor. "Now then, if Jim is agreeable, we'll open the packet." And he laid it before him on the table. The bundle was soon together, and the doctor had to get out his instrument case and cut the stitches with his medical scissors. It contained two things, a book and a sealed paper. "First of all, we'll try the book," observed the doctor. The squire and I were both peering over his shoulder as he opened it, for Dr. Livesey had kindly motioned to me to come round from the side table where I had been eating, to enjoy the sport of the search. On the first page there were only some scraps of writing, such as a man with a pen in his hand might make for idleness or practice. One was the same as the tattoo mark, "Billy Bones his fancy," and there was There was Mr. W. Bones mate. No more rum. Off Palm Key he got it. And some other snatches, most single words and unintelligible. I could not help wondering who it was that had got it, and what it was that he got. A knife in his back as like as not. Not much instruction here, said Dr. Lively as he passed on.